My job at the museum as oral historian, I work in the collections and exhibits department. My primary focus is managing the museum's ongoing oral history project. We've been doing this project for over 20 years since the museum opened, and basically I interview folks. I record videotaped interviews with people that remember John F. Kennedy. They remember the life and times and the death and the legacy of President Kennedy, and also the history and culture of the 1960s. We have over 650 interviews that we've compiled into this archive. And occasionally, we invite speakers that have done one-on-one interviews back to the museum for programs like this one. We call this program Living History. And the reason is because you guys are going to get to become oral historians yourselves. And you're going to get to interact with someone who lived the experience of the 1960s and someone today who actually met John F. Kennedy. So at the end of our presentation, we're going to talk for a little while. You guys are going to have the chance to ask questions. And so I want to encourage you to think like historians for the next 45 minutes. Think about questions that will be relevant 50 or 100 years from now. Think about questions that students, researchers, and historians want to know more about. Try to come up with questions that are very specific to the speaker today. So in other words, if he's not someone involved in the assassination story, asking him about why Jack Ruby wanted to shoot Oswald wouldn't be appropriate. But asking him a question about President Kennedy or what President Kennedy meant to him, that's the kind of question that might be valuable to researchers in the future. And if you look behind you and see that camera up on the podium there, that's the camera that I use when I go out and do oral histories. And so this interview, this little living history presentation, is being recorded for the museum's archive. So if you get to ask a question today, you'll be part of the museum's permanent oral history project. So that's why it's so important you come up with good questions, because this video will likely be viewed by researchers sometime in the future. Now with that, I want to get right into today's program. We are very, very honored to have someone with us today who is a true American hero. It's a two-time captain, Maury Seitz. He's a two-time captain because he was a captain in the U.S. Air Force, and he was also a captain in commercial aviation. He worked for American Airlines for many, many years. And specifically, we're going to be talking about just a small aspect of his very, very long and distinguished career. We're going to be talking about a period of his life when he was the co-pilot for the backup planes for Air Force One. And I'm actually going to ask Maury to explain what that means in just a second. But before we do, let's take a look at what Captain Seitz looked like at the time of the Kennedy presidency back in the 1960s. Please join me in welcoming Captain Maury Seitz here today. Now, Maury, I said you were a co-pilot for the backup plane for Air Force One. Explain what that means.
Well, when the President of the United States travels, he travels with the Secret Service. The Secret Service is with him everywhere. And in order for the Secret Service to be there, they have to be transported on an aircraft other than the one the President is on. There are special agents who travel with the President. They are his personal Secret Service men. Then there's a group of Secret Service men who are there to defend the President in case of any emergency. They are very well armed, they are very well trained, and you would be surprised at their ability to put down any type of a riot or an attempt on the President's life or anything else. And so they had to be physically on the ground when Air Force One took off, and they had to be physically on the ground when Air Force One landed. So President Kennedy had American Airlines as his primary transportation. In fact, we donated an airplane for his use for his campaign. And so when he became president, he requested American Airlines to fly the backup flights. Now, we were just straight charter flights. We had a designation with a 8 in front of our number, which indicated that we were a charter flight, but we were assigned to the White House. On board would be our crew, flight attendants, the press, except for the 2 or 3 reporters that were allowed on Air Force One, and the Secret Service. In the belly of that airplane was every armament, everything they would need in case of an emergency. So Air Force, we would stand by, we'd be back on the ramp away from the President's airplane, and they would board the airplane, Air Force One would take off. Well, we usually flew a little prop-driven airplane like a Lockheed Electra, was a primary one, or a DC-6, DC-7. He was flying Air Force One, a jet. But in the short hops, like we used to do up to Hyannis and up around the country. The small propeller aircraft could fly lower and not as fast, but they didn't have to go through all of the air traffic control procedures of climbing to a high altitude and all this stuff. Well, while they were climbing, we were loading and taking off, and usually we could get there within 10 to 15 minutes of the same time the jet did, even though we were slower. But we didn't have to go through all of the routes that they had to go through. So anyhow, we would take off, fly at maximum power, and land before the president did. And then they would get into their position, they'd unload their equipment, and the president would land. And then while the president was doing his thing, we were pretty much free to do anything we wanted to. But one unique thing about the crews is we had, I believe, 5 select crews that were assigned to fly for the president. We all had our clearances and everything. And so we were allowed inside the security area. We never had a problem. We were cleared by the Secret Service, and we could walk up to the president, we could do anything else. And so therefore, they gave us a lot of freedom that the average person would not have. And that's my story. I was with President Kennedy. If all of you remember, or have been taught about the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Russians started putting missiles in Cuba, and they were a direct threat to you and I here in Fort Worth at that time. They were well within the range. And the president had to make a decision about what to do when those Russian freighters with those missiles on board entered international waters approaching Cuba. And I was with him the night that he got the message that they had departed. They were en route. And at that time, he started making his decision of what he was going to do. So my story today is what happened during that trip to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and how he reacted and how he showed his leadership. So where do we go from here now?
Well, before we get to that story, let's talk a little bit about Air Force One. You got to tour Air Force One, and you even got to interact a little bit with the Kennedy children. Let's start there with the family, and then we'll talk about your encounter with President Kennedy.
Okay, doke. As you know, Caroline and John was what, about 14, 18 months old at the time. Caroline was about 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And of course, children are children. And they had to be treated as children, even though their father was the President of the United States. And that's one thing about Caroline and John. As small as they were, they didn't know that their father was president. They were just children. They loved the same things you do. John wanted to get in trouble. Caroline loved reading, and she loved to play ball. I think she was quite an athlete. And so there was a flight attendant in our group, Judy, who just seemed to click off with the kids. The very first time that she saw the kids seemed to migrate to her, and they did the same thing to me. So somehow or another, the Secret Service got the idea that we made good babysitters. Now, the children would always be brought to the airport before the president, and they would board Air Force One before the president. So there would be no distractions. They would be safe. If anything did happen, they would not be in the line of fire. And so occasionally, on quite a few occasions, rather than bring the staff babysitters and then have them have to go off the airplane and get all of their clearance and all this stuff, we already had it. So Judy and I would go over, and we would sit under the wings of Air Force One and play games with the kids or read or whatever. And when the weather got hot, we'd go on board Air Force One. Now, President Kennedy's thing aboard Air Force One was his rocking chair. He had a rocking chair mounted in that airplane that could survive all of the G-forces and everything. It was as strong as any airline passenger seat, but he could rock. And the reason he had that chair in there, when he was sunk in PT-109, he had severe back injuries, and he never got over. He was in pain all his life. And so he had that rocking chair there for him. But we used it to rock John to sleep. And he had a beautiful television, but that Air Force One was the ultimate in electronics at that time, the big TV set, the stereo. And we just sat in the president's room. He had a compartment, probably about a third of the size here. And he had a chair, and he had a easy chair and a couple of chairs for people that were in there. Very unpretentious. No leather, no mahogany, no nothing. It was just regular furniture. But anyhow, that's where we spent our time with the kids when we were on board the airplane. But I got to tour the entire airplane on one occasion in Detroit. But Air Force One was a Boeing 707, and it was completely equipped as a command post. In case of war, atomic war, with the atomic clouds and the atomic pollution, Air Force One was equipped to take the president and his staff and fly them to an area out of the contamination area. And from that airplane, they could communicate with every single commander in the world, direct communication. Anybody that was still alive could talk to him. And that has been continued. Now there are 2 747s that are equipped that way, and they're building another one.
But in the early 1960s, Air Force One was just state of the art.
State of the art. It had the turbofan engines. It had all of the electronic you could possibly do on it. It had extended fuel, and they were modifying it for in-flight refueling, but it wasn't finished at that time. But no, Air Force One was quite a piece of equipment. I would have loved to have flown it. Colonel Swindell was the pilot at that time.
Yeah, he's passed away now.
Yes, he has. Yeah. He was a wonderful guy. I got to know him. I got to know him much better than I did the Kennedy family.
Yeah. Well, let's go back. Your story before, in the days leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, is right out of a film. It's extraordinary, and it's very exciting and dramatic, and I just want you to tell that story in as much detail as you can.
Now what? The actual story of how it happened?
How it happened and your encounter with President Kennedy, and take us all the way through the end. This is a great story.
Okay, as I said, there were 5 of us crews that were assigned to fly with the President. And so I was scheduled to be here on November the 22nd with him. And we had a layover in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll get to the assassination later. I want you to go back to Minneapolis, St. Paul.
That's where I'm going right now.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And so we had been assigned, and I was in Tulsa. Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay, we'll get to that later. Okay, the other one. I'm 80 years old, folks. I'm grandpa.
There's a lot of great stories, though. You want to hear all of them, but let's go in order. So.
Okay. The trip to Minneapolis, St. Paul was right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis was building. They already knew that the missiles were there. The emplacements had started construction, but they didn't think that the actual missiles were there. At that time, they didn't know for sure. But anyhow, as normally happens in the United States, it was a political year, and it was between the presidential elections, it was a midterm election. And so Kennedy was traveling all over the United States supporting the Democratic candidates for governor and senator and representative. And so he would fly well, in this case, we flew from here to Detroit, and he'd covered all of the areas around Detroit, what we call political stumping. He would fly in by helicopter, make a speech, get on the helicopter, go somewhere else, make another speech, and sometimes I'd do 4 or 5 a day. So this one was to be based out of Detroit because it was in the operating range of the Electra, and it was so that we could relieve some of the pressure on Air Force One. So we flew from here, I was based in New York at the time, we flew from New York to Detroit. And you'll see in the picture, you'll see our airplane parked in the background where Air Force One was. And we arrived in Detroit and got our briefing on what we were supposed to do. We were going to fly to Muskegon, Michigan, which is up in the middle peninsula of Michigan. And he was going to make a speech up there. And then he was going to helicopter back to Detroit, where another Secret Service detachment stayed on the ground there. And we were to proceed to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we would meet him. Now, Air Force One was scheduled to fly from Detroit to Chicago. And there was a Naval Air Station there, and Air Force One in routine maintenance was due for an engine change. Normal engine change time is around 10 to 14 hours to change an engine on a 707. So it was scheduled then to have his engine changed, and then he was to proceed to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then he would bring the president back from there after he finished his tour. So Air Force One was out of the picture. And so the president actually flew from Detroit to Minneapolis, St. Paul, I believe, on a DC-6. And but any airplane the president owned was Air Force One. No matter if it was a Piper Cub or a 707, it was Air Force One.
Whenever the president stepped aboard, it automatically
became
changed its call letters to Air Force One. Yeah.
And no other aircraft was allowed to do that. So anyhow, we landed in Detroit. I got to get some pictures. And another thing that happens when you're a select crew is you have a clearance, the highest clearance you can get. You are able to go anywhere and do anything. So I asked the Secret Service one day, I said, how about, I know you don't allow private cameras, but what can we, is there any chance that I can, since I'm playing with the kids and, having fun with them, I'd like to put something in my memoirs and my memorabilia. And so I said, yeah. So I had a Kodak camera, shot 8mm film, and they said, you bring us the camera and we'll furnish the film, but you got to pay for it. So when I got to Detroit, I handed them my camera, and they put their film in it, and then they sealed it with Scotch tape. I still have the camera.
No, you've given it to us.
Well, they have it now, but it still has the Scotch tape on it. It's here in the archives. But it still has the Scotch tape on it where they taped it shut. But anyhow, what they would do, they did that camera, and then when we landed, they gave me my camera back. They were on the airplane with us, so they gave me the camera back. So I had the camera to shoot all the pictures I wanted. So I shot pictures on the ramp in Detroit, and then I shot pictures on arrival.
Why don't we take a look at that while we're at this
let's do
part
the
of the
film.
story.
Let's do the film. Then they'll understand what I'm talking about.
You have to remember, 8mm film in the 1960s, no sound, so this is a silent film, but Maury's going to give us some narration.
This is Air Force One, the most beautiful airplane in the world at that time. And that's when we were going on board. It, as I say, was about as advanced in technology as you could get. It had a real pretty paint job, too. And this particular time, it did not have the turbofan engines on it. It had the old water runners. So it was a little bit slower than the later ones. And then in the background, there we are. And that airplane, I'll tell you, a fly wouldn't dare land on it. Yep. And that's Colonel Swindell, the pilot. That's our Electra. And this is part of the Secret Service and the military cadre. In a minute, you'll see the president arriving, Mrs. Kennedy arriving in the helicopter. There they come. There are 4 Air Force helicopters, Air Force One helicopters. They're flown by Marine pilots.
There they are right there.
Yeah. They had been out to one of the small towns outside of Detroit, and they helicoptered out and were coming back. Let's see. This is just a typical activity as the president is approaching.
You never see civilian film shot this close.
No, this is shot inside the security perimeter. No civilian cameras are allowed in that area.
We're really lucky that Captain Seitz had his home movie.
Now, when he is on tour or he's going by, you stand by the street, but you don't get pictures of this. Now, we're in Minneapolis, we're in Muskegon, and he is helicoptered up from Detroit. And this leads up to one of the proudest moments of my life. And we mentioned Kennedy's back injury. If you look real close, you'll see him limping just slightly.
It's Kennedy right here.
Yeah. And he gets off the airplane. As you notice, as he comes out, I'm standing taking his picture, and he makes a slight turn and looks right at me and throws me a salute. And I'll tell you, that was the proudest moment of my life. That was personal recognition. I was the only one standing there, so it had to be me. I'll treasure that moment forever. Now, here he is going to speak. And I don't think you'll see it. That is not a telephoto lens. I was standing that close to him when I was taking those pictures. And that was when he was making his political speech and endorsing the people. And then that's when he took off in the DC-6, headed for Muskegon, and that is offloading in Muskegon. I mean in Minneapolis, St. Paul after we got there. And that's just a shot of our tail. And that's a picture taken from the limousine as we left the airport.
Oh, and then you have some
Well,
footage
to show you that this is just amateur film, the film has never been spliced. And this is a picture of the Nassau County Fair on Long Island, New York. And I was fascinated with the Golden Knights. This is the Golden Knight parachute team. So I wasted a lot of film showing, but the interesting, how fast do you think that a parachutist goes when they're free falling? How fast do you think they could go? Okay, right there.
400 to 800 miles
No.
per hour.
No.
What do you
Go.
think?
1,000 miles per hour.
No.
Oh my. What do you think of
One
that?
more. No.
No.
No, it's 224. Terminal velocity. If he absolutely streamlines himself, makes a bullet out of himself, he can reach 200 miles an hour rate of descent. And in one picture here, he's doing 200 miles an hour, and I think that's it. But they have unbelievable control over what they do and how they think. And these people are absolute marvels to watch. And anytime you get a chance to see them, like I'd go out to Alliance for the air show out there, they'll be there.
This demonstrates that this was just a 8mm family home movie, and when you would process your 8mm film, you would want to fill up the entire reel because it was kind of expensive to process film in those days. So you wouldn't want to leave any film left.
And you'll notice something else. Their parachutes are round. Those are no longer used. They use the parasail, which is much more easily controlled and will take a heck of a lot more stress.
I think for time, Maury, I'm going to go ahead and end the film here.
Cut it. Yeah.
But yeah. Now, take us back into your story. And,
Okay. Well, we left when after they left Detroit, we jumped in the Electra, flew up to Muskegon, landed. Secret Service got in position. They landed there. As you saw, we had the speech, and this is where things get interesting. Air Force One proceeded to Navy Chicago. We went to Minneapolis, St. Paul. Air Force One, which is now DC-6, landed at Minneapolis, St. Paul. We went to the Leamington Hotel there, which was the host hotel for the president, where the presidential suite was. And there was myself, my captain, my flight engineer, and 2 flight attendants were on the airplane. And no, there were 3 that day. We had 3. And so we went into our hotel, we got checked in, and we hadn't had time to get completely dressed and get out of the room when one of the president's aides came down and he says, the president is requesting your presence in the presidential suite. He wants to talk to you. So, wow. Well, the captain was from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and he'd gone home, so that made me the ranking member of the crew as co-pilot. So I rounded everybody up, and we went up to the presidential suite, and we were sitting there. Pierre Solinger was there, and nearly all of his staff was there. And believe it or not, they were all sitting around having a drink. Well, airline crews are not supposed to drink. Well, there's a rule. You don't drink 24 hours before flying. Well, they had figured it out that we were going to be there 24 hours, so the president told them if they can have 1 drink, and that's it. But we just want to be relaxed. This is just a quiet time. So we were there. We were talking to the staff, and all of a sudden the door opened and the president walked in. And they addressed him, Mr. President, and we all were introduced individually. And then we sat down, and he just started talking about what was going on at the time, and that, he appreciated what we were doing, and that he just thought that it was time. This crew had flown with him quite a few times, and it was time to have a little personal recognition. So anyway, we stayed up there about an hour, and as we went to walk out of the door, the Secret Service man leaned over to me, and he says, keep them close, and no drinking tonight. And I said, okay. So he said, get to bed early. So we knew that we weren't supposed to fly until the afternoon because he was going to fly down to White Cloud and give a talk down there and then come back. So anyhow, they invited us to the banquet where he was speaking in Minneapolis. And the head table was here, and we were sitting right at the end of the head table, the 5 crew members. And so the president was giving his talk, and in the middle of the talk, Pierre Salinger, the aide, comes out, taps him on the shoulder, he gets up and leaves.
Pierre Salinger was the president's press secretary at the time.
And in a minute, he comes back and he interrupts the president and taps on his shoulder, and they talk animatedly for just a minute. And then he walks by, and as he goes by us, he stops and he says, "Maury, get out of here. Take your crew, go eat." He told us where to go and said absolutely no alcohol. And he said, "I want you back in the hotel no later than 10:30. So we went, and we sat down, and 2 tables over were 2 Secret Service men. So we said, no drink, no nothing. But had a good meal, got back to the hotel about 10:15, and we still didn't particularly think of anything about it. But then just before dawn, there was a loud knock on the door, and I got up and opened the door, and there were 2 military policemen standing there with drawn weapons. And they said, "You have 10 minutes to get ready. Leave the bathroom door open. Do not even proceed towards the telephone, and you will be ready to leave in 10 minutes." Well, they did the same thing with the flight attendants. Well, believe it or not, the girls beat us. They were downstairs before we got down. They took us down in a freight elevator in the back of the hotel. The limousine was parked in an alley. It was completely blacked out. The driver was an idiot. I have never gone so fast in my life. And we went to the airport. And Northwest Airlines, that was one of their big stations, so they were in charge of dispatching. And by dispatching, I mean the captain had to be briefed on the weather, the passenger load, the fuel, and then he would pick the fuel load. We had to notify the company. We had to work with the dispatcher who told us what the company plan for us for this flight, and then we were to adhere to it. So that was a normal procedure. They had gone to get the captain, and so for the first 45 minutes or so, I was the senior pilot there. And so I went over to the Northwest dispatcher, and I said, "Well, I better call the company and get a flight plan." He says, "No, you don't." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You don't get a flight plan. You don't talk to anybody. We don't talk to anybody." And I said, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" He says, "Don't ask any questions, just do your job." So my job was to get the weather and to plan the fuel and all this stuff, which we were trained to do. So I did all my work, and then I noticed something. Always our charters were preceded by, we would be American Airlines 8114 or whatever it was. It was always an 8. This time, our call sign was White House 1. Never heard that phrase before. So the Secret Service was there, and I walked over with a friend of mine, and I said, "What's the story?" He said, "You'll be flying the president. He'll be on board. That's why you can't communicate with anyone. We have an national emergency." So he said, "Oh, okay." About that time, the captain came in, and he looked over the work and everything, and he was okay with it. So we went out, and we were ready to board the president, start all 4 engines. And the steps were down. On the Electra, the steps came down in front of the propellers. And the propellers are 14 inches in diameter. 14 feet in diameter, I'm sorry. And they weigh 1,800 pounds. And they spin at 1,150 RPM. And they're at low RPM. And there's only 3 feet between the path to get to the door and those propellers. They said, "Start all 4 engines with the door open." The captain said, "I can't. It's against procedures." He said, "This is a presidential order. You will start those engines, and you will leave the door open because the door had the steps." So he turned around to me, and he said, "Let's start them." So we started the engines, and about that time, the limousine came up. And it stopped, and the Secret Service had lined up, locking their arms together, and their backs were less than a foot from those propellers. And they stood as a human shield between him and the propellers. We got out, 3 people got out of the car that looked like President Kennedy, Pierre Salinger, and one other, I can't remember the other person who was on the board. But anyhow, they ran up the steps. The Secret Service guy ran up the steps. They closed the door. And they said, don't turn your aircraft lights on. Just what we call the taxi lights. Very, very dim lights. No radio contact at all. Everything will be hand signals. So after everything was done, they hand signals, gave a salute. We pulled out from the ramp. We went to taxi. The runway lights and the taxi lights were turned down. You could hardly see them. And the Secret Service man stood between us, and he says, okay, this is your taxiway. I know the way. Just believe me. So we started taxiing, and it was black that night. There was no moon at all. It was pitch black. And we still thought, we had the president on board. So we taxied out, and just about the time we approached the runway, during World War II, they used flashlights to tell you when to stop and start and everything, but they were just a red slit in a long tube so that, quote, the Germans couldn't see them. There was no way anybody could see it unless you were right in front of them. So all of a sudden he says, watch for the X, and the red X came up, so we stopped. And he said, now look up, and we looked up, and we were sitting right under the tail of Air Force One. Air Force One had gone to Chicago, and they had changed an engine in 4 hours and 45 minutes. It was sitting right in front of us. And about that time, the Secret Service guys came up and pulled off the gear. The president was on board. He had doubles on the airplane.
You were a decoy.
We were a decoy. We were White House One. Nobody knew where. Everybody in the world thought Air Force One was in Chicago. It had come in completely blacked out, no radio, had landed in Minneapolis with no radio contact with the tower, anything. Nobody knew that airplane was on the ground except us. You can bring a jet in so quietly that if it's done properly, nobody will ever know you're on the ground. So anyhow, they said, well, now we got to do it. We got a problem. Air Force One sounds entirely different than an Electra does. How are we going to camouflage the sound of the engines? And so it's a very simple trick on the Electra. You just get, you know what synchronization is, where everything sounds together and props turn together. Well, we can flip a switch and that doesn't happen. Well, then an Electra on takeoff sounds like it's just everything is all over the place, and it's a piercing sound, and it will drown out a jet engine. So we followed Air Force One by about 100 feet. When he rolled, we rolled, and no lights at all. We could just see the flares from his engine, and the next thing we knew, he disappeared. We never had any radio contact. We were given a heading by the Secret Service and an altitude. Then, probably 10 or 15 minutes out while we were climbing, we had a single broadcast, and it just says, you, didn't say who, where, how, or when, are cleared, direct Washington, direct destination, never said where we were going, any altitude, any speed. You will be given radar vectors. That's where the radar man on the ground tells us you're on heading. So we took off and headed for Washington. I found out how fast the Electra will go. And I've also sat there and watched those engines sitting right in the caution line before they go to the red line. And we set a flight record between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Washington, which we can't claim. We saved 30 minutes of the time. But anyhow, we landed. Normally when you come into Washington National, you had to fly down the Potomac River and wind around and everything, keep flying over the White House. Well, back in those days, the ground-to-air missile was the Nike, and they could blow anything out of the air. And the White House and the Capitol building were completely surrounded by a nest of these missiles, and they were radio controlled. Once they turned them on, they would lock onto whatever they were tracking, and the tip of the missile would just follow. So they said, you're cleared straight in to runway 18. They put us right over the White House. And the captain says, what did you say? And he says, you are cleared straight in. And we flew over the White House and hear those missiles just tracking us. We're about 200 feet or 300 feet above them. So we land and we taxi up to the ramp, what they called a Marine terminal. It was not like the U.S. Marines, but at one time they used to fly seaplanes into there, and it was the Marine terminal, which was for the seaplanes. So anyhow, that was now the military match ramp. And so they're on the ramp. Let's see. band and reporters and the dignitaries and everybody was there to meet the president. Well, we knew we didn't have him. So the Secret Service says, just act just exactly like you were thinking. We were still White House 1 over the PA system. They heard White House 1. And we taxied up to the ramp. Now, I don't know whether you've noticed, but when the president appears, they play two things. The band plays two things. The first is ruffles and flourishes. Dun, 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 dun. Then there's 5 seconds from the time they finish that till they start playing Hail to the Chief. Dun, 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 dun. There you go. I'm not a singer. But anyhow, we parked, shut down the engines. The band struck up ruffles and flourishes, and just as they started it, we pushed the button on the door, and I was standing in the door because he said, you're the same size, pretty much the same size as the president. So as the door went up, I was standing in the door, and in the 5 seconds between the time that they played ruffles and flourishes and they played Hail to the Chief, over the PA system said, this is the President of the United States speaking from the Oval Office. As far as we can find out, and I think he'll back me up, it's the first and only time that the press, the military hierarchy, nobody knew that that wasn't the president standing in the door of that airplane until that moment. They had completely fooled him. Air Force One had gone into Andrews Air Force Base and he'd helicoptered to the White House. So that was my part. Now this occurred, there's a book called The 13 Days of October, and it covers the period of time when President Kennedy had to make his decisions about Cuba. Well, we were 15 days before, so we were 2 days before the 13-day count started. And the night what had happened is he had received a message that the freighters were entering the waters headed towards Cuba, and they had confirmed missiles on board from reconnaissance pictures. So that night and that next morning, he made the decision of what he started making the decision. I don't know whether you know it or not, but there was 110,000 troops, 38,000 airplanes ready to invade Cuba. And they were on standby for 72 hours. For 72 hours, all it would take was the president saying yes, and they would have been airborne. Cuba would have ceased to exist. We would have lost a lot of people because until the morning before, we didn't know they had active missiles. They were ready to go, and they had some warheads down there too. So it would have been a catastrophe. And President Kennedy played poker. He played his poker hand against the Russians, and the Russians flinched first. They were 30 minutes from launching the attack on Cuba when the Russians turned back. So the Russians just flinched one bit, and then Kennedy came in. And that saved many, many lives, and it saved World War III from starting. Right. And so if you ever have any time to sit around and you're interested, The 13 Days in October is one of those spellbinding books you will ever read. Secondly, it shows you what true leadership is. He was under pressure from everybody to attack. And I don't know what religion you are, but as you all know, President Kennedy was Catholic. He was a very religious man. He was a man who made his own mind up. He wasn't told. His brother Bobby had a lot of influence on him. But this was one time Bobby was wrong. Bobby was telling him to go, and he wouldn't. And he stood up against every single person that was his advisor and said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to sweat it out. And he won. He bluffed out the Russians with their poker hand. They had the poker hand. He was bluffing. I mean, we were bluffing as far as not wanting to get the involved with an invasion. But that was the world situation at that time. And from that point on, the Russians lost power, ending up in the collapse of the Russian government.
We want to go ahead and take a few minutes of questions.
Yeah, let's have some questions.
If you have questions for Captain Seitz.
Okay, we're going to start on the front here.
Okay, but hang on. Since we are recording this, I need to repeat the question so we'll be able to pick it up on the microphone. So go ahead and say your question. I'll repeat it, and then he can answer.
Start right here. We're going to get everybody. Yeah.
What was it like actually meeting the president?
The question was, what was it like to meet the president?
Well, for an old little Mississippi boy that was 2 years old when the Depression started. I was your age when World War II started. I was 12. I was 19 when I went into the service. I had 3 brothers, and they were all in World War II, and then I went in after one of them came home. And I lived through the Depression, I lived through World War II, I lived through Korea, I lived through Vietnam. And for a kid from the wrong side of the tracks in a Mississippi Railroad town to be addressed personally by the President of the United States, there is no feeling like it. None. It's just something you never forget. It's just burned into my memory. Okay, who was next? We're going to go down this row. Who's next? Yes.
Did you ever meet Bob Kennedy?
Did you ever meet Bobby Kennedy?
Yeah.
And also RFR.
Who?
You mean Edward Kennedy?
Edward?
The 2 brothers?
The one that ran in 1968.
That was Bobby
That
Kennedy.
was Bobby. He was assassinated also. Yes, I did meet Bobby. In fact, we were playing with Caroline and John, and we were sitting on the stairs. They went up in the airplane, had runners alongside, and we were sitting on there playing ball with them. And, it was a very, very tight security. But in Hyannis, where they were and where the airport was, the runway ran out into the ocean. And so the water was only about 250 feet from where we were sitting. And I'm sitting there with my back to the water, and all of a sudden I hear squish, 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 and the hair just stood up on the back of my head. What is squish, squish, squish doing close to the kids? And I turned around, and here was this tow-headed guy with a T-shirt on and a pair of white slacks with white tennis shoes on that were squishing in full of water. It was Ted. It was Bobby. And he was coming over to see his nephew and niece. And he introduced himself, and we talked for a minute, and he played with the babies, and then he squish, squish, squish back and got on his boat and left. And then I met Teddy Kennedy later on, the younger brother, who is now still who's regrettably has a horrible disease and is dying. But I met him through the airline. Since I knew him, I had met him through the family. At that time, he had broken his back in a plane crash.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so during that period of time, but later on, I met him and got to know him personally. He would fly back and forth between Washington, New York, and Hyannis on my flight, and anytime he was on my flight, he would come up to the cockpit and we'd talk. But no, the Kennedy family, I was quite impressed with them. They were very unusual. They were patriarchy. The father ran the family, but the mother was very powerful. And the kids, I mean, they were just everyday kids. And once you got into the inner circle, there was no difference between them and the neighbors down the street. They just had a lot of money. That was all.
Next question.
Okay, next. Okay.
Oh, my.
You've already had one. Didn't you have it? Yeah?
No, I don't think
Oh,
he's
okay,
asked
go
the
ahead.
question
No.
yet.
Oh, go ahead. No. All right, you ready? Let's get you there.
That's fine. Well,
Yeah.
go ahead.
How old were you and the president when you first met him?
Okay, that was...
How old were you when you first met President Kennedy?
Okay, let's see. I was born in 1928. You do the arithmetic. This was 62, 61? Yeah, it had to be 62.
It's the Cuban Missile Crisis, 62.
To 62. So 28 to 62 is... Come on. 1928 to 1962.
40 years? 34. 44 years.
Right.
44.
All right,
44.
44. Next question.
I'm 80 right now. Okay. Okay, now you.
Were you with President Kennedy when he was assassinated?
The question was,
Yeah, I can...
where were you when President Kennedy
Okay.
was assassinated?
Being a member of the 5 crews, I was scheduled. We were our schedule ahead of time. I was scheduled to fly the trip to Dallas with him. We flew our regular trips up until the day of the charter. So I was in Tulsa on a normal scheduled layover, and we were scheduled to get back to New York in time to take our legal break, and then we'd fly on down to Washington and then come on down to Dallas. Well, just as fate would have it, we had an engine failure on takeoff, and we had to go stay in Tulsa and get an engine change. So they assigned another crew, and I missed it. But one interesting thing was, due to the fact I knew Colonel Swindell, and I was a member, and we talked to him very often on our airline radio. We had a special frequency we could talk to Air Force One. So I didn't think anything of it. We were about halfway between St. Louis and New York headed home, and I knew that he was scheduled to be on his way back to Washington. So I just put out a call on that frequency. My call sign was Gray Fox, and because even at 44 I had white hair. And anyhow, you just call Air Force One, this is Gray Fox, and they would usually answer. Well, this time I made the call, no answer. I didn't think anything of it. About 10 minutes later, I made the call again, I got no answer. And I called a third time, and then a radio signal louder than anything I have ever heard in my life said, this is Air Force One, this frequency is no longer available. God bless you, good day. That was it. It said, check your radio. Well, we thought that they meant check our airline radio, which is a very high frequency VHF radio. He didn't mean that. He meant check commercial broadcast. We could pick up WFAA or any of the stations. But we didn't think about that. So we just went on fat, dumb, and happy into New York, and we landed at what was then Idlewild Airport, which is now JFK. And we plugged into the ground, and the mechanic on the ground said, Maury, is that you? And I said, yeah. He said, have you heard? And I said, have I heard what? And he said, the president's dead. And I said, you're kidding. He says, no. He says, the president was assassinated. He's dead. In Dallas? And I said, and he said, yes. I said, really? If you're lying to me, I'm going to be very embarrassed. He says, what do you think I'm crying for? So anyhow, my captain, I turned to the captain and said, the president's been assassinated. And he said, well, since this captain I was flying with was not my regular standby captain. And he said, since you know the president, it's up to you to tell the people. So I made the PA. And the door was open. We could hear what was going on in the back. We heard a few gasps, and then a quiet sobbing, and then total silence. Nothing. Everybody that got off that airplane, nobody said a word. And we announced that in the terminal they'd set up TV sets all over the place so they could see everything. And they all went into the terminal, and we just sat on the airplane. I don't think I got off the airplane for a half hour. And I just got in the car and drove home. I mean, that was as sad a moment as meeting him was as proud, because the man accomplished miracles. He put us on the moon. He saved us from a world war. He was a true leader. His personal life may not have been the best in the world, but as far as a true leader, he was. And many, 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 many nights since that time, I have waked up and wondered what the world would be like if he had served another term. And no telling. But I may be prejudiced, but I think he was one of the best presidents we ever had. And I will always remember it that way.
Maury, I got a signal. We're very, very low on time,
okay.
So we can't take any more questions, unfortunately, but I know you want to make a little comment here at the end, and so I want to leave that open to you.
I'm Grandpa. I'm 80 years old. I'm going to speak to you just like I would if I had my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren sitting around the patio outside. I want to give you some hints about how life. Number one, yesterday you can't change. Learn from it. Don't make the same mistakes that were made yesterday and the day before. You got to realize today is yesterday's tomorrow. So what you planned for the future, you're doing today. So do the best you can with what you've got. And then remember that tomorrow is the future again. And without today, tomorrow won't exist. So plan for the future. And if you don't have a dream, you're never going to go anywhere. As an 80-year-old man, I could sit here and tell you that I've accomplished every dream I ever had as a kid, as far as career, family, everything. And it's a very wonderful feeling. Now third, freedom is a privilege. It's not a God-given right. That freedom was earned by young men and women who have fought from the Revolutionary War through and given their lives so that you have the freedom of speech. You have the freedom to bear arms. All of these freedoms came at a price of human blood. My brothers and sisters, somebody else's mother and dad, and it's happening today. Don't ever forget that the freedoms that you are experiencing now were bought with blood. They weren't free. And they will continue. If you want to continue to be free, you've got to support that. People are going to disagree. You will never have a nation that agrees on everything. But they're throwing the words socialism and socialized and communist around now when they talk about government controls and government administration of public works and government distribution of wealth. After World War II, during World War II and immediately after World War II, the government had a price for everything from apples to everything. Sugar, apples, butter, everything was rationed. You got a coupon book and you could only have what was in that coupon book. You didn't make it last, you went hungry. Shoes were rationed, tires were rationed, gasoline was rationed, price controls. No manufacturer could charge more, or a certain percentage more than it cost them to build something. So we didn't get price gouged. Gasoline wasn't $4 a gallon. A shirt that takes 35 cents to manufacture wasn't selling for $500 just because it had a name on it. We were not in a socialist country. We were in a free country because we wanted these controls so that we could get this country back under control again. It's going to happen again. It's got to happen again. We have deregulated and decontrolled everything, taken the power away from the government, put the power on the people, but the people are not capable of governing themselves. It's being proved right now. You've got to have government supervision over certain things. Public works, highways, going to have to be medical care because medical care is going out of sight. But just remember, the fact that they're trying to put some of this stuff back under our government control and to control prices and even to control wealth. When a 14-year-old can make 14 times what the President of the United States, I'm talking about Maury Seitz, 14 times what the President of the United States, there's something wrong. And it's not you kids that are wrong. It's your parents for letting you do it, for letting you buy those CDs, and for letting you spend money for things like that. When we are giving away our industry, we're becoming a service country. My charge to you, go out, learn to make something. Learn to build something. Learn to help people. Go into medicine. Do those things. Let's get this country back to where we are a country of workers, not servers. And let the middle class come back again. And I am an absolute independent as far as political. I'm not a Republican and I am not a Democrat. But the time has come to get this country under control again, and you are the ones that are going to do it. So, my only wish to you is that on your 80th birthday you can be like I was. Healthy, happy, and still in love with a little gal I married 57 years ago. I can't wish you any better. Now go out there and raise Cain and let these people know that you know what's going on and do what you have to do to get this country back. It's still the greatest country in the world. I've been all over the world. There is nothing like it. I will guarantee you. Preserve what you've got. We've gone to excesses. Let's get back to reasonable. So, God bless you all, and I really, really appreciate your teachers and yourself for coming.
Thank you very much.